Hello everyone, welcome to this course on Talend Data Integration Studio. This course is specifically designed for the beginner level. We would start with the basics of Talend Data Integration Studio and proceed further to build complex workflows on Talend Data Integration Studio. Before we start, let me give you a brief introduction of this Talend tool. Talend has two different solutions for various data management and data integration operations. The first one is Talend Data Integration Studio, and we also have Talend Big Data Studio. Talend also offers various other products. However, we would focus on Talend Data Integration Studio and Talend Big Data Studio for our data management and ETL operations. Talend has both Open Studio and Enterprise editions, which makes it quite popular among the various other ETL tools. We will start with Open Studio version of Talend Data Integration, and we would see what are the basic components that are available and how can we use those components to build our ETL workflows. Now we know what does Talend do. Let's see why do we need Talend. With the rapid increase of data across various platforms in an organization, it is important for us to manage this data, store this data, and build ETL workflow which helps us in data management of all the different types of data that is scattered and spread across various applications. Talend is one such solution which helps us in integrating all the various types of data and making the data ready for further analytics and business intelligence solutions. We would see what are the various use cases that we come across in our day-to-day data management operations, and we would see how can we use Talend to give an efficient solution for all our ETL needs. Let's begin. As we said, this is beginner level difficulty, and we must have the following skill sets to make our training more efficient. Starting with RDBMS, a basic knowledge of relational database management systems. How do we store data in relation data management systems, and what kind of structure, let's say the table, and what kind of data that can be stored into the table, that is the structured data. Why do we know we need to store it in form of tables, and what kind of operations, what kind of normalization techniques, what kind of SCDs, the slowly changing dimensions that we can do on an RDBMS systems and data warehouses. Such knowledge would help us more. And then having a basic idea of ETL concepts like the extraction, transformation, and load. These are the high-level steps that are involved in the ETL process. Apart from this, what are the steps that an ETL workflow would need, like pre-processing of data, data cleaning, and all other steps. Having basic knowledge of ETL would be an added advantage. Also, since we deal with data, we would do connecting to databases and we would do some data extractions. A basic knowledge on structured query language, like the queries where we use the selections and the aggregations, grouping, all that would be a great help. However, as we come across these SQL functionalities, we would go ahead and revisit our basics just to have a quick idea of what are we working upon. Moving to the objectives of this course, participants would be able to get familiar with the studio once we have this course completed. And further to that, we would design and build our Talend jobs for ETL use cases, and we would see how can we achieve them in Talend Studio. What do you learn in this course? We would start with downloading and installing the Data Integration Studio in our local machines, and then we will see how can we design our first project and build our first job in the Talend Studio. Further to that, we would go ahead and design our ETL workflows. We would try connecting to databases, we would try working with different file formats, and we would do all the basic operations that we can perform using Talend. Further to that, we would see what are the various components that Talend offers for. Talend has hundreds of components for various functions and functionalities that we would do in a ETL process. We would go ahead and see what are the various components that are grouped, and we would go ahead and use most of these components that are available in Talend Data Integration Studio. Are there any course requirements or prerequisites for this? Well, yes, as we have discussed, basic understanding and basic idea of RDBMS concepts and high-level understanding of ETL pipeline, what are the various steps and stages that are involved in an ETL pipeline, and the basics of structured query language. These would be our prerequisites. Moving further, who are the target students for this course? We would say any participant who wants to work in the ETL domain or data management domain and who is already working in ETL domains and want to explore Talend as a tool, and participants who wants to work with data, in fact any data management, data loading, data analysis, data analytics, business intelligence solutions, they would be interested to get a hang on this tool. Further to that, whoever wants to improve the learning curve and understand a ETL tool, learn a ETL tool and explore Talend as an ETL tool for their internal business use cases. All these participants would be greatly benefited with this course. So, what do you have by end of this course? What are the skill sets that you can achieve by end of this course? You would get full-time hands-on exposure on Talend Data Integration Studio. This course is focused to be very practical in approach. We would do all the jobs and workflows on the Talend Studio. We would design them, we would run them, and we would validate the jobs and see what further changes are required for that jobs. So this gives us end-to-end experience on building the studio jobs in a real-time environment. Yes, we would design, we would run the jobs, we would use the components that are available for Talend, and we would see how this is being benefited. What are the course contents? The course content include how can we set up and install Talend Studio. We would go ahead and download Open Studio that it is available on Talend website to our local machines, and then we would start installing the setup and we would bring up our first Talend Studio. Further to that, there are different views that are present in Talend. There is a component view, there is a repository view, and there is a palette which has all the components. There are multiple views that Talend has in the studio. Once we get the studio, once we start our studio and design our first project, we would go ahead and see what are those various views that Talend has and how can we benefit from each of the view and when do we want to switch between these views. Further to that, we will have, as I mentioned, there are hundreds of components that are available in Talend. So Talend groups these components under various categories. Let's say if there is a file category, we have components where we can read a file with different delimiters. There is T file input delimited component, there is a T file output delimited component which helps in writing file to other output path. Like this, we have hundreds of components. We have components for file group, we have components for database group, we have components for connecting to the different databases, creating tables, managing the data in the databases, and we have components for doing file checks, we have components for printing the results, we have components for filtering, and there is a tmap component which is very powerful in helping us to achieve various data management operations, data cleaning operations, and data pre-processing operations. There are components related to the various joins. So we would see all of these components and have an overview and full understanding of when to use which component to perform our ETL needs. Then we would use these components and go ahead and create our jobs. We would start working with our jobs and then we would validate the jobs and see what are the best practices that we can include in designing this job. For every job that we run, I would give you overview of what are the common errors that we make in building the job and how can we avoid those and what are the best practices that can be added to that particular job. Well, yes. Next, we would go ahead and see how do we handle delimiters. See, once we are working in an organization and once we have multiple applications that give us data would be in different file formats. Once we might come across data that it is a CSV file that's comma delimited, and sometimes we come across a pipe delimited files, or sometimes it's an ampersand. We would go ahead and see how can we read all those kinds of data using the components that are available in Talend, and if there is any conversions that are needed from one delimiter to the other delimited, we would go ahead and do that use case and read the data from the source file and write the converted delimited file to the target file. We would see all this delimited file handling operations, and further to that we would also see how do we actually handle different kinds of files from source and target systems, and what are the various operations that we can perform on top of the files. Next, we would start connecting to a database. We would see how can we create a connection to database and how can we connect from Talend to any particular RDBMS database, and then we would start reading a source file from any of our applications, and then how can we write that source file data to a target database table. We would see that. Along with that, we will go ahead and do all kinds of DDL and DML operations on the database tables. As I said, while we are doing all these functions, we would always see what are the best practices that are involved and how can we avoid any common mistakes or errors that we can do while building these jobs. I hope that is interesting and that adds value to what we are designing for. Further to this, we would see all the components, explore all the groups, explore all the components, and see why each component is used and what are the benefits that that component has to offer for. We would see TMAP, which is one of the powerful components that's available in Talend. There is a lot that we can do with TMAP component. We can do many operations like data transformations, which is primarily used for, and not just data transformations, we have multiple use cases that we can build on top of TMAP. This is a very useful component that Talend offers for. We would explore and see how can we make more use cases depending on the TMAP component. We have T-filter component, which helps us in filtering the data. We would go with use cases where we accept the data. Sometimes we filter the data and we want to work on the rejected data that T-filter component has filtered for. We would see what kind of filtering operations that we can do on data and how the filtered data can be used for further analytics. And then we would go ahead and see what are the various joins that we can perform in Talend using the T-join component. How can we do these joins on two different sets of data, and how can we further take the joined data for the use cases. So we would go ahead and see all the major components that are available in the Talend Data Integration Studio, the Open Studio version, and we would design jobs with those components. And further to the jobs, we would go ahead and build efficient ETL pipeline, which helps us in building an end-to-end data management. We would try building an end-to-end ETL pipeline, which includes reading the data from a source system and doing any manipulations on the data, like converting the delimiters or reading the top 100 records, skipping some of the records or skipping some of the columns, these kind of data manipulation operations. And further, once we have the data ready in our system, we would go ahead and do data transformations using joins, using TMAP, using filtering operations and various other data transformation operations. And once the data is transformed, we would write to the target system, be it a database or be it a file, and we would see how the data is transformed to the target system and is ready for further analytics. This is all we will learn in this Talend basic course. This is the beginner course that we are starting with, and we will get end-to-end hands-on experience on Talend Data Integration Studio. I hope this sounds very exciting.